Hola, buenos días. Continuamos con la serie de charlas de la Escuela Técnica Superior de Ingeniería Informática, de la UPV. En este caso, vamos a concluir con el programa de seminarios técnicos que tenemos con la empresa belga Xplore Group. Esta empresa, como sabéis, está impartiéndonos una serie de seminarios y talleres muy interesantes. Y en el caso de hoy tenemos al ONG spin-off de Humix, una empresa que forma parte de Xplore Group, y que nos va a hablar de temas de usabilidad web y de diseño. El ONG spin-off es una ingeniera web, diseñadora web de esta empresa, y nos va a dar unos consejos, unas experiencias muy prácticas a la hora de realizar plataformas web, páginas web. Bien, quisiera recordaros que la semana que viene no tendremos charla, ya que se celebra el Match Empleo, que es el evento que la Universidad Politécnica de Valencia ha puesto en marcha para sustituir, en este contexto de pandemia, a lo que era el Foro E. En este Match Empleo tendremos una serie de charlas muy cortas por empresas que están intentando buscar o reclutar estudiantes para prácticas o para empleo, con lo cual os recomiendo que echéis un vistazo al programa. Habréis recibido correo informativo sobre ello. Y tras ello, pues voy a dar paso, antes de la charla, a Alfredo Gil de nuevo, que por parte de Xplore Group, que nos va a comentar un poquito de esta empresa y nos va a introducir un poco mejor la charla de hoy. Gracias de nuevo a Alfredo por toda la gentileza y me ha comentado que va muy liado y la verdad es que es muy de agradecer que dediquen tiempo a compartir su experiencia y todo su conocimiento con la universidad. Y, en fin, esperemos, he estado hablando con él, a ver si para el año que viene, para el curso que viene, podemos repetir esta experiencia porque la verdad es que ha sido muy, por lo menos desde nuestra parte, ha sido muy gratificante y pensamos que todo este conocimiento técnico que nos aportan de primera mano las empresas, pues siempre complementa muy bien todo el tema teórico que damos en la universidad. Gracias.
Pues muchas gracias, César. Por nuestra parte, igualmente, es súper importante hacer estas colaboraciones con nosotros para así mostrar lo que hacemos a los estudiantes y que así puedan saber que pueden contactar con Xplore Group y estar en este proceso de continuo unión mediante la universidad y nuestra empresa, pues para aportar lo máximo posible a su experiencia. Nada, nuestra colaboración con la UPV ya ha sido con 2 charlas. Hicimos una de AWS, de infraestructura en AWS, y la otra de un caso real de seguridad informática en una de nuestras plataformas e-commerce. Y nada, me presento. Mi nombre es Alfredo Gil. Hace 3 años y medio que estoy con Xplore Group. Estoy encantadísimo de estar con ellos. Estoy desarrollando la parte de España, de la empresa, y son retos continuos, últimas tecnologías, tratan de maravilla a sus empleados. No puedo pedir más. Me encanta la productividad, get things done, y hago mentoring y coaching. Os dejo mi LinkedIn por si queréis contactar conmigo sin ningún problema. Podéis preguntarme cosas, hacia dónde me enfoco, no sé, todo lo que queráis. Estoy a vuestra disponibilidad. Pues nada, os hablo un poquito de Xplore Group antes de la charla de Loneque. Esta es nuestra web. Actualmente somos 800 empleados. Hemos crecido una barbaridad estos últimos 4 años. Yo cuando entré éramos 200, imaginaos. Y ya somos más de 60 Competence Centers. ¿Qué es un Competence Center? Pues un Competence Center son pequeñas unidades de negocio que se centran en tecnología. Cogemos a gente apasionada por una tecnología, alrededor montamos, como digamos, una pequeña empresita y a partir de ahí expandimos esa empresa con toda esa gente que sabe solamente de esa tecnología. Entonces, tenemos desde AWS, Kubernetes, desarrollo con muy buenas prácticas, Java, PHP, así que seguro que os podemos asesorar sobre cualquier tecnología que tengáis curiosidad. Actualmente estamos en España, Bélgica, Alemania, Holanda y Reino Unido. Como podéis ver, trabajamos con las últimas tecnologías. Así que estamos a la última. Si queréis preguntar cualquier cosa o que os guiemos, no dudéis en contactar conmigo. Clientes famosos que podáis ver, pues Bose, que es el de los altavoces, G-Star, que es el de la ropa, Straumann son prótesis dentales, supermercados, principalmente comercio electrónico, Toyota. Estamos alrededor de toda Europa haciendo grandes cosas. ¿Y dónde estamos? Estamos en el edificio Europa. Estamos en la planta 13, unas vistas increíbles, al lado de la UPV, por si os queréis pasar cualquier día, son bienvenidos. Y os voy a dejar hoy con Loneque, que es una experta en esta materia de UI y UX, porque antes no se tenía mucho en cuenta a la hora de implementar, solo querías buenas prácticas, buen código, la interfaz no era lo más importante, pero hoy en día se sabe que con esto, por ejemplo, en el comercio electrónico se incrementan un montón las ventas, se hace más facilidad y hoy ya sabes que si tú una aplicación, por ejemplo, la abres y no te gusta y tal, pues no tiene futuro. Así que os dejo con ella, que es una experta en la materia. Muchas gracias.
Hi, I'm Lonneke Spinoff, and I'm now starting to share my screen. Okay, I'm giving you a lecture, a short lecture about user centricity and what it means and how you can use it in your development projects. I'm sorry. So what I'm going to talk to you about is a short introduction on what is user-centered design, how you can use it, and where it fits into the process. We'll have a look at UX design principles, how to collect user insights, what are user journeys, and how you can translate your insights into wireframes and then into the development cycle. But first, maybe a short introduction. I'm the founder of UMix. I've been a UX research for about 15 years. And I started from user research. So identifying who end users are, what their needs are, and trying to translate that into new screens and designs. And that's what we still do at UMix. We're now with a team of about 14 people, UX, UI designers, and conversion specialists. And we all try to translate user needs into good user interfaces and to make sure that the complete experience of end users is what it should be and is an added value for those users, and in that way also an added value to the company. But now let's dive into the content. Well, user-centered design, what is it? It can be a lot. And it's a term we hear more and more every day. And you hear terms like UI design, usability, customer centricity, UX design. They're all terms that are used mixed, and they all identify smaller parts of the whole spectrum. And I'll try to run you through some of the main differences to give you an idea on what we mean when we talk about UX design. But the general thing is that whenever you talk about user-centered design, it means that you involve your end users throughout the design process and in your ideation process to make sure that what you are creating is also easy to use for your end users and not only for you from your way of thinking. To give you a little bit of an overview, we all heard about UX and UI design, and also at UMix we have UX designers and UI designers, and they both tackle a different set of the user-centered design process. So it all starts with user research. A UXer dives into the research, tries to create, to understand who the end users are, where the frictions are in the current applications they're using, how they work, how they think, and try to translate that into first designs, wireframes, prototypes. And then it's up to the UI designers to further elaborate on those basic designs, make sure they become not only easy to use, but also pleasant to use by making sure they connect with the branding guidelines of the company to make sure that visually they are also attractive and easy to use. So it's the both disciplines that work together to get a good end result. But it are different disciplines. Another distinction can be made between UX design and usability. for us, usability is a part of UX design. Usability is how easy it is to use something. It's a very specific, how easy is it to perform a specific task in a specific environment, where user experience is the overall experience. You can have a great usability, but still a bad user experience. If you order something online, what we've all done a lot lately, you can have a web shop that's very easy to use, but if the delivery is too late, or the size of the clothes you selected don't fit or don't match with what you thought you were selecting, then your user experience goes down, even though the usability of the web shop was great. So for us, usability is a part of user experience. And also, another distinction is to be made with functional analysis. It's something, especially in more development, people with more development background, it's sometimes difficult to make the distinction between UX design and functional analysis. Of course, within UX design, we also tap into the functions of an application, and we also tap into what's useful for the user. But that's what you do in UX design. In the UX design, you identify what functionalities are useful for the user and how they should work together. Where in a functional analysis, you typically look at how technically the different functionalities work and how you can implement them. So in the example of this house, the door works. You can open and close it. There are enough windows, you can open and close it. There's a roof, but it's not on the right sides. The doors are not placed exactly. So if you do a functional analysis and a purely functional design, you might end up with a house like this. It's the UX design that makes sure that the right elements are at the right place and you select the right elements. So to put it simply, user experience is how a person feels when they interact with your system. Do they feel happy? Are they delighted? Are they frustrated? It's all those things that you want to design during a user-centered design process. So yeah, I can tell you a lot about feeling and what is user-centered design, but yeah, how do you design a user experience? To give you an example is this one. Say you have this set of cutlery and you need to bring structure and you make them need to make sure they will be of use. You might do this. That's an easy one. You make a distinction between forks, knives, and spoons. You also might do something extra. Identify the differences between the different forks and between the different knives. But this is what UX does. It places the forks and the knives and the spoons into a context, and it makes them usable and gives the added value to the specific pieces, to the specific functionalities. So in a user-centered design process, you tap on 4 elements, and I typically I also compare it with an onion. So you start with the basics. The utility is the product we're designing or the application we're designing. Is it useful? Is someone waiting for it? The next level is it easy to use? Is the product we're designing or the application we're designing, is it easy to use? And the next layer is, does it give any added value? Does it give something extra? Does it give people the feeling they want to use it? And the the outer circle is all about the brand experience. So does it tell you something about the brand experience? That's the typical Apple example. They are at the level of a brand experience that they're designing, and not only at the desirability of the product itself. It's more about the complete brand. So how do you achieve this? Yeah, well, certainly not by doing this. You are not the user as a designer, nor as a developer. You are the end user. You're always developing or designing something for someone else. So thinking in someone else's place or placing you in someone else's feet is never the same as being there. So you have to try to involve end users to be able to know what you're talking about, because otherwise you might end up with something like this. You might end up designing something or thinking you have the best solution for something where that's not actually answering to what people were looking for. But how do you do it? Well, there's a process. User-centered design, as I mentioned before, and it's a circular process. You start with requirements. From there, you go to a concept. You test your concept and your ideas. New questions might come up, and you refine and you go deeper until you've run through your circle enough to go to the building and creation of an application. We also work based on the what we call the double diamond. It's almost the same as the user-centered design principle, but it shows a little bit more how ideas evolve. So you start with a basic idea, and first you open up all possibilities. You start diving into who are all those users, what are they doing, what's important for them, and you try to learn as much as possible to get your picture needs to be as big as possible. So that's the opening. Then in the next phase, you start to refine and you start to try to create a concept based on all those insights. So you go back to the middle and you try to translate that into a design. So, and once you have your concept or your basic design, you do the same. You first open up that, okay, this is where we want to go. This is how we want it to work. How can we do it? So again, you open up, discovering all the possibilities on how to build a certain application or how to build a certain interaction, to again narrow it down to the final solution. So this is what we call the theory of the double diamonds. But yeah, user-centered design, as I've said before many times, it's all about the end user. But how do you involve them? How do you learn about those end users, and how do you collect your information? We can make a very big distinction between qualitative methods and quantitative methods. And almost all methodologies to collect user insights can be placed within these sections, where qualitative methods tell you something about why things happen, what's happening in users' minds, and how you can solve things. Where quantitative methods tell you something about how big a problem might be, or how many users run into it, or how much money you might be losing because your checkout funnel is going wrong somewhere. So it helps you to prioritize and to get an idea on how big the issue is. So make sure that you focus on the right things. As I said, we have your qualitative and your quantitative, and if we have a look at all the different user research methods, we can place them on two axes. Research methods that focus on behavioral and on attitudinal. So behavioral is how are users doing things? What are they doing? Learning about their actions, where the others more dive into opinions and what do they think is important and how do they think about what you're presenting or your ideas. And then there's the distinction between qualitative and quantitative research. Where you see an example of A/B testing, you might have heard about. A/B testing is an online test you run on a live website where you separate two versions of a design and you separate your visitors. You show them one version or the other and you see what works best. That gives you insights about behavior because you're registering what people are doing, but it is quantitative since it's no personal interaction. You cannot ask a why question, where user research or usability lab studies are all about behavior. What are people doing? But they also tell you about the qualitative. They allow you to ask people why they are doing certain things. So here again, we see our process, and you can see where the different methodologies are placed within the process. And depending on where you are, you might use different methods to collect your user insights. I'll briefly run you through the different, some of the main methodologies we use during our work. But something I want to give you along before you start diving into user research is users are no designers. They will not design for you. And we all know the quote, the user is always right. Yes, that's true. But they don't know what they want. If you ask someone to design something that they don't know, for instance, a new car, if they haven't ever seen a car before, they don't know what to do. So that's why we always focus on interviews and observations, which you will see in the next slides. So one of the first methods we typically use are user interviews. We try to identify user needs, what's important, and it's typically something you do before you start designing. So this is really getting to know your end user and to get a start on design, on how to design your ideas and how to do it. What's important is determine the purpose of your interview. What do you want to know? What are the gaps? Create an interview script so you know what you're going to ask, but leave enough room for diversion and to have chats and learn from your user. Recruit representative participants. So make sure that you talk to those people who will actually be using the application and not only the managers. Another form of interviews are what we call contextual inquiry. These are interviews in the context of use. So in the office, next to where people are typically using their application. This gives you, especially in applications, it gives you a lot of insights about how people are currently using a certain application and where they run into. The post-its on a computer or the manuals they take from their drawer whenever they need to perform a specific task tell you a lot about where the difficulties are in the current process. And that's something someone will never tell you during an interview, and you can't ask because you don't know it's there. So that's why if it's possible, we prefer to do contextual inquiries with end users. And of course, In the current period, that's difficult to do. So we had to do a lot of user interviews instead of contextual inquiries. But it's really important. And when you perform contextual inquiry, it's really important to play the fly on the wall. You want to invite your participants to show and tell what they're doing, to take you along their trip. Another form of user research is a focus group, where a focus group is typically, we have a lot of customers who think that a focus group is a cheaper way of doing user testing, which it is not. You cannot do a user test during a focus group. During a focus group, you gather feedback on design ideas, you gather opinions about what you're doing, or what people are currently doing, or what's important for them, but you don't test the specific tasks of an application. And when you organize a focus group, it's really important that you formulate your objectives upfront. You recruit the right participants, so and not too much. If you have more than 8 to 10 people in a focus group, it becomes too big, and too many people will not say anything. So you need to keep your groups small and interactive, and make sure that the right people are around the table. So again, managers are always important, but not always the end user. So if they're not the end users, they might listen in, or you have a separate focus group with them. But it's important to make sure that the right people are around the table. And it's also very important that as a researcher or as a UX designer, you lead the discussion, but you don't participate. You want the people around the table to tell you you're learning at that point in time. So you want them talking and not putting ideas in their heads. Another form of surveys or getting to know your end user is what we call intercept surveys. These are small, targeted questionnaires that pop up on that you can have allowed to pop up on a website to ask people directly some very short questions. And it works very well because it's really targeted and it's really easy for people to answer. So we typically get really good results with this. It allows you to ask for feedback when people are actually using a website. So if you then ask something about an element on the website or about their IDs, then you get a different form of feedback. What is important when you set up this kind of surveys is that you determine the exact purpose of the query. So you only can ask 1 or 2 or maybe 3 questions. So make sure you focus on the right things and you ask those things you actually want to know. It's better to run 4 different surveys in different times instead of 1 big one, because you'll get less answers if you do 1 big one. Make sure that you ask easy to answer questions, not too many open questions because they're difficult to work on later on. And also think about the period in which you want to launch your intercept survey. So not only 1 day, but during a week, and what's going to happen in that week. Are there new product launches on the website, whatever, things that might change the way people are answering your questions. So those are things to keep in mind when you set up a survey like that. A specific form of intercept surveys is a top task questionnaire. Here we ask people why they are coming to an application or a website. What's their main focus? This helps you to identify the primary tasks of your end users, and so you know where to focus your design on later on. Another way of getting feedback from end users is an email or an online survey. This is typically more difficult to get a large amount of answers because people are not always interested in filling out a long questionnaire. So think about it before you start using it. And then the form of user testing, of user involvement we work with the most. User testing is a way of, or what we also call, it's also called the usability test. It's a technique to evaluate the use of an application. So we ask users to, invite them individually. We ask them to perform a specific task within, or multiple tasks within the application, while we observe what they are doing. It allows you to discover where there might be big errors, or where what people run into when they are using the application. So user testing is not done with trained usability testers. It's not a technical way of testing. It's really important that that's a big distinction between software testing, what you might all know. It's about inviting real users to perform real tasks in an application or a prototype. And you can do it at different times during your cycle. We sometimes do it in the ideation phase, where we want to discover what's going wrong with the current application, but we also do it when we have our first designs or our first prototype. So it's different times in the setting, and depending on where you are in the cycle, you might do it in a different way. There are three big distinctions between usability test methods. The first one is the in-person usability testing. You sit in one room, you observe what someone else is what your participant is doing, and you will be able to ask questions about the why of their actions. The second form is moderated remote usability testing. It's almost the same as in person, but it's in a distance. And of course, the last year, we've done mainly the moderated remote user testing via Teams or another video call, where you ask people to share their screen so you can have a look at what they're doing. And we find that it works very well as well. We were a little bit hesitating at the beginning, but we find now that it allows us to recruit good participants, people. It takes less time to do your user tests because there's no traveling involved, etc., etc. So it is an easier way of the in-person usability testing, but of course, sometimes it also has its limitations. It's difficult to do when you need to test a mobile application, for instance, or when your usability test also encompasses physical elements that you need to test. And then there's unmoderated remote user testing. It's almost the same setup, but it's automated. So there's nobody there to ask questions, but you record all the sessions and you dive into them later. It allows you to also test specific tasks with specific users, but collect a bigger amount of data or test with a larger group of users instead of the other ones. But for all types, there are 5 basic principles. First of all, define your test objectives. Typically, you cannot test every possible task. You have to identify which are the main tasks and where might be the main problem areas. So identify what you want to get out of your test. Second is recruit representative users. As I said before, the recruitment of good participants that really represent your end users is crucial for your for the conclusions you can take from your test. And then it's important to formulate your tasks correctly. You don't want to explain them what to do. So if you run a usability test on a web shop, you will not give a task like place the red pants into the shopping basket, because no real user thinks like that. A real user comes to the website and is looking for a red trouser. So your task will be, dear user, you're looking for new red trousers, try to find one and buy one on this website. And then you will see where they run into throughout the complete process. When observing a user test, is very important to observe and listen and not to interfere. You cannot explain. When your end user is at home using your application, there's nobody there to explain as well. So sometimes it's difficult, especially when people run into problems, but it's really important not to tell something about how to solve a certain problem or how to perform a specific task. And then, of course, analyze the results and do something with it. For a typical user test, we work with groups of 6 to 8 people. Because we're not looking for quantitative data, we're looking for qualitative data. And what we find is that the majority of substantial usability problems will arise between 6 to 8 people. If you want all of the usability problems to arise, you will need such a huge group that it becomes too expensive. If you have multiple user groups, we typically limit to about 5 participants per group. So now you've heard all about how to collect user data and insights about end users. The next step is to try to get an idea on what does it all mean and start going to a design solution or a product solution. And the first step we take is we try to bring everything, translate all our insights into what we call user journeys. And a user journey shows you where and when a user interacts with the brand and or product. And this we do within a specific scenario. So what we're looking for is answers to who is using what, where, why, when, and how. And we try to map it out on a journey. But and it all starts with identifying who are the users. So before we start drawing user journeys, we have to identify who our users are. And that's when we start to create personas. A persona is a representative of a user group. It's it's a fictive person that helps you to identify with the main characteristics of a specific user group. So a persona typically consists out of the following components. So you have a profile, who is your user, a personality, what influences them. Sometimes we use a quote because sometimes it can help you to give a better idea on who that type of user is. If relevant, their technical expertise, what their goals are, which devices and platforms they have experience with, some domain details. So depending on for which products you are creating a persona, you might have some details that are important here. For instance, if you're creating an application for nurses, you might need some details on the type of work they're doing or their experience in that domain. One of the very important things in a persona is the typical, what we call the must do or must never do. So those things that that in an application will make that your user will be your biggest fan is your must do. If that's in the application, they will be your biggest fan and they love to use your application. But on the other hand, there are also things that will be your ultimate turn off. If that happens within an application, your user will never come back again. So that's really important to always take along within your persona, because it will help you throughout your design process. So when we know who our users are, our personas are, then we start to identify what are those top tasks. I talked about the intercept surveys. So we try to identify what are those main tasks, what are those 5%, 6% tasks that are performed the most within your application or on your website, or why people come there. And good UX always focuses on those top tasks, but doesn't forget about the rest. And so you focus on those main tasks, and the rest should also be there in a logical way. But it starts always from your top tasks. And then when we identified who our end users are, what the top tasks are, we typically run a user journey workshop, and where we try to map out together with our working group from the customer, or sometimes with some end users, how their journey actually looks. Which touch points do they use? Do they start on the website? Do they enter the shop somewhere? And where they run into. And that delivers what we call a journey. And you can visualize them in many, many ways. Online, you'll find a lot of examples. And depending on the situation, we'll also use different visualization to those journeys. But it gives you insights in what touch points people use and where they run into their problems when performing a specific task. And that will be the next step to start designing your interfaces, because now you know how the flow is, you know what people are doing, who they are, what's important for them, so we can start designing the screens. Where, I don't know your previous knowledge, but the wireframe translates all those user insights and the journeys into screens. Finally, we're at those screens. And this is also where the interaction design is created and shown for the first time. How are all those elements are going to be represented on the screens? Which elements are on the same screen? Which are in subsequent screens? And how are they going to look and to work? Wireframing is always an iterative process. You'll never get it right from the first time. So we typically start with high-level sketches, as you see on the left, and then it evolves to more detailed, grayscaled designs for the site, that identify all the specific elements that should be represented on the different screens. So if you evolve from your wireframes and your very high level sketches, you'll go to a block frame, eventually a wireframe. That's what you just saw on the right side. And then gradually you evolve into interfaces and a designs prototype. And that's where UI design comes in. The last two are typically the steps where a UI designer is becoming part of the story and is joining the work. Well, I think the biggest advantages of working with detailed wireframes before you start to develop is that it's a communication between your customer, the designer, and the development team by show and tell. It's always a risk when you only explain something, because you don't know what images people have in their minds, and that's where it goes wrong. It avoids a lot of misunderstanding. If you have a wireframe of a prototype and you run user tests with them and you still need to adjust something, it's much cheaper than if you already have a completely developed prototype or beta version of an application before you start testing, and then still have to revise. The further along you are in the development process, the more expensive it becomes to make adjustments. So the more reluctant you will be to make adjustments. That's why we always do user tests with wireframes, so it's easier to adjust, and people and also within the team will be more open to make adjustments and to throw out their previous designs or previous ideas. And it also is a very good starting point for a development team. It's typically the starting point for a functional analysis so they have a good view on which elements should be there, how they should work, how they should interact with possible databases in the background, etc., etc. And from there on, they can build their functional analysis. But also, it's the first step into the UI design. It clearly indicates where the different elements should be, how they should work, and then the next step is to make sure that they're designed in the best possible way and represent the style guides of the company. And just to give you an idea before ending my presentation, when you're designing wireframes, we typically make use of what we call UX design principles. They're generally applicable laws and guidelines that are based on previous experiences. And they help you to make good design decisions. And they're very high level. It's not a very specific design of an element, but it's the principles you need to keep in mind when you are designing an interface. And just to give you an idea, here are 3 very commonly used ones. First one is Fitts law. It's about the difficulty to activate a button, for instance, to tap on a certain target. So especially in touch screens and in mobile designs, it's really important that you make sure that the elements people should be tapping on are big enough, and there's enough spacing between them. So these are basic principles you need to take into account when you are designing buttons for instance, on a mobile screen, but also on a desktop screen. If things are too close together, people might accidentally activate wrong buttons, and that's a disaster in the user experience. Another one is Hicks law. It takes a lot of time and effort to make a decision, and this increases with the number and the complexity of your choices. So try to minimize the amount of choices, especially when response time is critical. If you have a complex task where a lot of decisions or choices need to be made, it's better to split up your very big task into smaller steps in order to decrease the cognitive load. We all heard about the 3-click rule. Well, that's an old rule. It's not because you have less clicks that it's always better. You have to make sure that people are able to understand each step of the way instead of making one big step just to limit the amount of clicks. Of course, I'm not saying that you have to add as much clicks as possible, but you need to find a balance between those two. And also, for instance, you see it more and more on e-commerce websites, for instance, when there's too much choice, people don't know anymore. So you see on Amazon or big e-commerce websites that they're helping you to make choices. The 10 most sold washing machines, for instance, that helps you to find your way within the huge amount of choices that are offered. And then the last one is the law of proximity. Objects that are near to each other tend to be grouped in the minds of people. So when objects are visually close together, people also conceptually group them together. So this can help if elements really belong to each other. Try to connect them, place them together, and people will understand that they are one group. But don't accidentally do that, because people might think things belong to each other while they don't. There's also another way of looking at design principles. When we look at interfaces, we typically work with the 10 heuristics of Jacob Nielsen. First one is the visibility of a system status. Is it always clear what the system is doing for people? Make sure that there's a clear match between a physical, between the system and the real world, especially if you're translating an offline process into an online process. Allow users to control and to recover from their errors. That's one of the next ones. But also allow people to go a step back. Yeah, if you offer a wizard, allow people to go one step back if they suddenly realize they made the wrong choice one step before. Make sure you're consistent and make use of standards. Don't reinvent the wheel every time and time again. People think we all have our habits. We're all used to that things are done in a certain way. Make sure that that you use the good things from those already existing principles. Make sure that you that it's not only things are not only explained in word but also visually. Help people to prevent errors. Explain how they should enter their date of birth instead of having them try to see what's the correct notation for the date of birth. Try to allow people to have a flexibility in the way they are using things. Go for a great design, but don't overdo it. Make sure that form follows function always. And then make sure that you help your users when they run into errors. When something goes wrong, try to explain or make sure that your help message or error messages are clear and help people to solve what's happening without having any technical knowledge. And make sure that you provide sufficient help on different elements within your application or interface. And then some very specific mobile UX design principles. Prioritize your content. Make sure that the most important thing is at the top, and you go into more detail the more you go down on your page. Think about intuitive navigation, how you place elements according to each other. Make sure, as we mentioned before, that your targets are big enough for our fingers. Make sure people have the feeling they're in control and that your text is well enough, well readable. It's not too small on your smartphone. Make sure, especially in mobile, people use their mobile phones everywhere. So think about how external light might influence the visibility of your designs. Think about hand position when placing your buttons. Minimize the amount of data that needs to be put in. So automate as much as possible the data entry into forms of whatever. If possible, try to create a seamless experience over your different platforms. So if people added something in their shopping basket while using their mobile phone, and when they're at home, they enter the web shop again via their desktop. Make sure that the same item is still in their shopping basket so they can proceed with the purchase. And then last but not least, keep on testing. Test your design before you launch, but also after, for instance, using A/B testing. Well, that brings me to the end of my talk. I think that the three main takeaways I would like you to take along is that user-centered design places the end user in the center of the design process. It's all about them. It tries to translate user needs into a clear briefing for development and design, and it allows you for early feedback and testing, and thus improvements of your end product before it becomes too expensive to make changes. So this was my talk. If you have any questions or want to elaborate on things, don't hesitate to get into contact. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I see my link is not here, but you always can connect me there. So this was my talk. If there are any questions, I'd love to hear them.
Hi, thanks, Roneke. It was really interesting, especially because you cover some parts of the design and the experience that usually we are not specialized in this topic. We are more centered on the technical aspects. So I think it was really interesting for our students because it's also really important to consider these aspects or this view from someone with the experience that you have. So I don't know if there are some comments or questions. You can make them in the YouTube comments. In any case, Loneke was very generous, and she's going to share with us the slides. I will put on the web of the school, and she also has left the email, her email and her LinkedIn account, so you can contact her directly. So if there are not comments, thanks again to Loneke, and thanks again to Alfredo and Xplore Group. This was the last talk of these seminars, of this program of seminar, that it has been really successful and really good experience. And I hope to see you in the next event. Thanks. Bye.